Are you in the city or are you kind of just out of it?
Actually, pretty in it. I mean, it's not a big, huge. I'm not in the middle of downtown where the high rises are, but I'm just east of downtown.
Good stuff. How big's Austin actually?
It's about 1 million. I can't remember where it is now. It's growing like crazy and has been for several years now.
Is there not supposed to be, is it like a lot of Californians and stuff kind of migrating there?
Exactly. Yeah, 150 people a day or something moving here, or they were before the pandemic. I don't know what it's like now.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it
Wow.
was. Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah, so they couldn't build apartments and houses fast enough because there were just so many people moving. I mean, there were some people moving out, but nowhere near 150 a day.
Why so many? Out of interest.
It got on all these lists of best places to live in the country, and people figured out even before the pandemic that they didn't have to pay California mortgages and rents to do their jobs. And so companies moved here, individuals moved here and worked remotely. It was a really cool and affordable town, and now it's a somewhat less cool and much more expensive town. I still like it, but it's going through, I'd say, growing pains.
Yeah, it'll just take a kind of moment to readjust to the new way of things, I suppose.
Exactly. You're in Glasgow?
I'm back in Aberdeenshire at the moment, actually. I'm usually Glasgow, but we're back in another lockdown at the moment. So I kind of migrated back to my folks for a little bit.
Got it. So you're on the East Coast?
Yeah, northeast, right up in the kind of corner.
Cool. We were up just west of you last year, not for work or anything, just for fun. Drinking scotch and seeing pretty mountains and stuff.
Whereabout were you?
Went all over. So right in the middle of that park to the west of you. What was the name of the town?
The kind of Cairngorms.
Yeah, exactly. And so a bunch of towns there, and then we went up to Isle of Skye and all that.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful drive, like if you go round the full coast.
Yeah, it's stunning. I've been to Scotland a couple of times now, and what's the closest distillery to you? I should have drank a bottle of that.
Closest, there's one at Old Meldrum, which is quite close to me, just a small one. There's quite a few dotted about up here, though. You've kind of got Dufton, which is Glenfiddich, and Aberlour is not too far away either. There's a really nice modern distillery up at Aberlour, actually. Like, they've built this massive kind of open, like, glass top building. It's beautiful. Like, into the side of the hill. It's pretty incredible.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Fun. And what's the small one near you?
Old Meldrum?
Old Meldrum. I don't know that one. I don't think we get that one over here.
I'm not sure what brand of whiskey it is. That's just the name of the town. Yeah, Scotland's quite good for a holiday because you can kind of, if you're coming over from America, you can kind of do the full country in like a week and a half, couple of weeks.
Oh, Glengarioch. I have a bottle of that. So tonight I'll drink I'll drink that and think of you in Old Melbourne. Meldrum.
Are you a big Scotch drinker? You a fan?
I am a fan. So I've been slowly trying to drink something from every distillery in Scotland, and I'm about 80% of the way through.
That's pretty good going. How many distilleries in Scotland? A couple hundred or something?
It's not as many as you would think. It changes, of course, but it's like 130, 140, something like that. And I'm somewhere around 100 that I've done.
I guess it's the kind of same as everything. The independent ones are kind of finding it harder to survive.
Yeah.
As the big brands closing.
Exactly.
Are you in your studio at the moment?
I am.
Is that a separate building in Austin, or is that kind of attached to the side of your house?
It's attached. It was built purposely as a studio, but it was built attached. I like not having to leave the house in order to go to work. I just wander down the hall and then I'm in the studio.
I guess you kind of get that good middle ground where you actually have a different place that you have to go, but you don't have to travel very far to get to it.
Yeah, it's the best of both worlds where it feels separate. It's like I'm definitely going to the place where I work and create, but it's not the home part of it. So it's a little bit of both.
Is the whole kind of building wooden inside? I'm just having a look now. It looks like you've got like wooden panels and stuff.
Yeah, that ceiling is old picket fences. And yeah, that they did in that herringbone pattern. The floors are wood and the bookshelves are wood. So a ton of wood and 16 foot or so ceilings. So the sound is pretty good in here.
Yeah, get a nice kind of acousticy thing going.
Yeah.
I can see you're quite a big reader too, right?
Yes, I do like to read, and this has been a good year for reading.
Not much else to do.
No, yeah, I mean, all the things that I like to do the most are really easy to do at home. Make music and read books and walk around in nature, and you can do all those things without being near anybody.
Will you go through phases when it comes to reading? Do you kind of read about a certain subject, or is it just pretty free flowing?
It's a bit of both. I'm definitely a deep dive. If I get interested in the subject, I order a whole mess of books, and I've got a stack of books, and or if I get into an author, I'll get a whole bunch of their books and do that. But I've almost always got quite a few books going at the same time.
It can be nice to dip between two. Like if you have a non-fiction and a fiction one going, gives you a bit of a balance.
Yeah, exactly. One gives a break from the other, and you come back with a clear head. It's like making music. You switch projects and then come back, and then you have a fresh perspective.
Do you find you read more fiction or non-fiction?
Pretty equal, I'd say. I mean, I read a bunch of poetry, and I read some like plays or scripts as well, and then a lot of nonfiction, and then novels. I'd say I read short stories, maybe the least of the basic categories, because the starting I find to be the hardest thing, and short stories ask you to start over and over again.
I guess if you get a short book of short stories, it can be okay.
Yeah, no, I enjoy short stories, and I like Alice Munro or James Baldwin. There are some great short story writers that George Saunders that hard to resist.
Yeah, I read a great small kind of collection of short stories recently. They were kind of evolved around the same character. It was called Jesus' Son. I can't remember who wrote it though.
Oh, that's my favorite short story book ever.
Is it actually?
That's Dennis. Oh yeah, Dennis Johnson. He actually taught here in Austin for a little while. But yeah, that like Alice Munro's big work. What is it called? The stories are connected. So you're. It's not like starting over each time, even though they could stand alone. You're getting deeper into this world and in this interconnected way. So it's both it's a novelistic short story collection.
It's intriguing too when you have a slightly unreliable narrator. It kind of gives it a little bit of spice.
Yes, exactly. And since you were in Glasgow, and which reminded me of Kelman, who I met years ago. James Kelman.
I'm unfamiliar.
He's a Glasgow-based. What's his big book?
When was he kind of in prominence?
I would say 20 years ago he was the biggest deal, and one of them. How Late It Was, How Late was his big novel hit in '94. But it's all it's in dialect to a degree, and like an amazing Scott. All of his books are fantastic. So we had my partner, she and her company adapted one of his novels into a play. And so we had a week of hanging out with him and all his Glasgow friends and drinking a lot and hearing Scottish stories.
Nice. Is he kind of similar to Irvin Welsh, that kind of Scottish colloquial type thing?
Yeah. I'd say Irvin Welsh is more raw, and Kelman is, it's plenty visceral as well. I mean, at least with Train Spot, it's not as like Bad Boy as Train Spotting, I would say.
Yeah, a little bit more balance between the light and dark.
Yeah, exactly.
Was that the first time you met him when you came over here?
He actually came over here. So that's the first time I went to Scotland. It was for I was doing live accompaniment to a theater piece, and so it was like a live radio serial, sci-fi radio serial that we did in Edinburgh. So yeah, I went around, being a tourist all day and performing at night, and then drinking as many scotches as I could after that.
Living the dream.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, what an amazing trip.
How did Kelman compare to what you expected of him based upon his writing?
He kind of lives the stereotype. Living hard, drinking, fun, loud, full of stories, and I don't know. Glaswegian versus other areas, but it felt like what you hanging out with him and his whole crew felt like what you would imagine hanging out with a bunch of Glaswegians to be.
Yeah, the rest of Scotland's a little bit tamer in comparison to Glasgow, I think.
Yeah. I sometimes get a bottle of White and Mackay which is very cheap over here, to put me a bit into the Glasgow mindset.
Do you ever find that with music as well? You know, if you listen to a piece of music that's very connected to something for you, it can kind of transport you into the mindset of where you are at a different point in your life.
Oh yeah, I mean, I love travel in a quote real way, but I also love armchair travel. So, you know, I'll read novels, cookbooks, poetry, history, all about a place, and really, as well as listening to the music, all to really immerse into it. Like China is a good example, where I've been to China a few times, but also have read a lot of ancient Chinese poetry in translation. I wish I could read Mandarin, but I'll read the poetry, I'll read the history, I'll read contemporary novelists and things like that, and as well as cooking the food. And like Chinese percussion has definitely been an influence on me, and some of that really has informed some of the work I do.
In terms of what you were saying there about, you know, armchair traveling and really immersing yourself in the world of something, was that kind of a similar process when it came to the opera that's coming out virtually, I think, on Friday? Or it came out once before, the Pancho Villa from a Distance?
Yeah. So that is a world I've been immersing myself in since I was about 8 or 9, really. So that has a whole long history behind it. I guess I was about 9, and we went on a trip to Mexico City with my family, and it was the first time I was out of the country. It was the first time I was in a place where English wasn't the primary language. Just the first time I felt so clearly other. And I had an amazing trip, and so it made this huge impression on me. And the paintings the muralists in particular made a big impression on me. The food, the orange juice, kind of everything about it. And then in my adult life, then I moved to Texas, which of course used to be part of Mexico and has not only a large Mexican American population, but a huge portion of Mexican culture woven in. And now every year go to Mexico at least once or twice. So I've built up this personal relationship to Mexico, and then I'd always wanted to work with Mexican and Mexican American artists on a project that sort of dove into that. And we had this commission out in West Texas, and we were driving around West Texas looking for an operatic figure, and figured out that Pancho Villa used to live in El Paso, which is right across the river from Juarez, so right on the U.S. and Mexico border. And that became the subject for the opera, and another excuse to dive further into Mexican history.
As soon as you found out about him, did ideas immediately begin to spark?
Yeah, exactly. Immediately started creating ideas and making music. And I really like to do works in progress and try out ideas at shows and things like that. So just, rough charts, and then improvise on them and see what's working with an audience. And so we spent a couple of years really doing that. And then spending more time in West Texas and in Chihuahua, Mexico, as well as in Mexico City, working with Lagartillas, our librettist collaborators. And so really fully immersed in that. And of course, read a whole bunch of books about Pancho Villa and all that. I also studied Latin American history in college, so it really all wove together.
And the opera's bilingual as well, right? It's both in Spanish and in English.
Exactly. It's not a straight narrative or a straight biography. It's like a collage of scenes from his life and from the Mexican Revolution, both on the Mexican side and on the El Paso side. And so it's mostly in Spanish, but with a bunch of interludes that are in English.
Do you find the two languages have quite a different musicality to each other?
Yes. There are more natural rhymes and just an easier flow in Spanish than in English. English is such a mashup that it can be a very awkward language to work with musically.
Yeah. It's funny then that a lot of the world's music, you'll go to a lot of these countries that speak Spanish in Europe and stuff, or speak German, and all the music is kind of still in English. And not all the music, but a large portion of it. when it's kind of so poor at rhyming in that way.
Yeah, it's, these trends. I mean, it used to be that like all opera was in Italian, and then, Mozart and Beethoven start rebelling a bit, and the sort of lingua franca. And at the moment, it seems like English is the international language, and that might be here to stay for a good while because these things are slow to change. But it's strange that it's such an unmusical language has become the dominant musical language.
There was a guy, who was it that hit Billboard #1 last year, though? It was a Spanish, or I think it was a guy rapping in Spanish.
Oh, is it J Balvin?
No, I can't.
No,
I can't remember.
Yeah.
I feel like as we kind of move past genre, though, in terms of the way kind of the culture, digests music, it could start to move away from that a little bit, and we could start to see the languages open up.
I think that's. I mean, having those Spanish hits cross over into what here at least is mainstream pop is an exciting moment where you see just more cultural diversity being embraced in this very real way. It's one thing to talk about it or do it in like these environments where it's easy to sort of curate the inclusivity, but pop music is such a just straight up commercial enterprise as far as at least the business end of it, that it's happening naturally, that it's getting more diverse is an exciting development.
And as a result of it being such a commercial thing, if they see something like that being successful, they'll start to kind of chase it a little bit and look for something in a similar vein that could also take off, which could then spur that on.
Yeah, exactly. I see no reason why this wouldn't keep heading in that direction.
Yeah, that is the invigorating thing about mainstream music, is that when one thing kind of catches a light, it sparks a wave that kind of takes off.
Yeah, exactly. When those things are inspiring musically, it can be exciting to see. Variations on a theme is just a classic way to do things, and in its own weird way, pop music does that, where a certain kind of beat comes on, like the reggaeton beat, which is so simple, and yet there'd been 20 years or more of hits and variations revolving around that basic beat. It's always in there and it's the core of it, but the music keeps going down different branch points.
Is that the same in a score? Like if you kind of find the theme for a character and then you can kind of put it in different contexts and settings and play around with it a little bit?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the leitmotif you associate with Wagner, but I really think of Beethoven being the one, for me at least, that's most had the most command of motivic variation. The Beethoven's Fifth, since everybody knows, is the easiest one to think of, where he takes those four notes, and those four notes become this basis for this gigantic epic thing, and he keeps flipping them upside down and connecting them and transposing them and doing everything he can with those four notes. And so it doesn't feel like you're hearing a little thing, but it is all based on this tiny, tiny little idea. That's why I enjoy hearing what people would do with these pop music ideas or what jazz ideas or whatever it might be, where they take something small and simple and clear. And like with Beethoven's Fifth, all you hear at the beginning are those four notes. There's nothing else going on. So it's very clear, teaching the audience, here is your theme. Here is your tiny little motif. And everybody learns it. And then he does a variation on it immediately by pitching it down. And then he's off and running. And so I really like when you give the audience a chance in that way, where you teach them this vocabulary that you've invented and then explore it, and they can, to whatever degree their sort of listening skills and music theory knowledge allows, they can follow along with you on that exploration. Beethoven makes it very easy for the most casual listener to follow that, but also people obviously spend their lifetime studying Beethoven scores. And so there's a huge depth there, but with this very accessible exterior.
It's almost like reeling in a fish. Once you get that hook in at the start and you've got them, you can kind of take them wherever you want.
Yeah, it's exactly. I mean, that's the idea of the hook. And, Beethoven or a jazz player is not using it in the same way that a pop song uses a hook, but the idea of it catching, and then that creates interest. And why do you keep listening? Because you want to know what happens to that character, and that character is that theme, that hook.
Does the hook and the rest of the music almost come from your brain then? Do you have to kind of tackle them in separate ways?
The hook can come, the generation of those themes can come from all sorts of different directions. If I'm understanding your question, but I mean, sometimes it just comes out of your head. Sometimes it comes out of improvising. Sometimes it comes out of extracting something, like a classic beat that you extract and then manipulate and to make your own personal version of that beat. And so it's got that core, but you've changed it and personalized it and made it yours. So it can be intellectual, or it can be emotional, or it can come from any of a myriad of directions.
Do you know as soon as you have it? As soon as you stumble upon that, do you know that's going to be the hook?
Sometimes sometimes you think and if I'm on a roll and creating a bunch, I like to over-create and then edit down to the strongest ideas. Often in the moment, if I'm feeling it, I feel I can get a little cocky about it. And in the moment where you feel like, oh, this one's good, and this one's good, and this one's good, then you show it to somebody, or you come back to it, and then you figure out, okay, that's fine, but not exciting. And this one is stronger, and this one's in the middle, and this one's also strong. You can also have the kind of days where it's the opposite, where you're generating ideas and you're capturing them because that's what you're supposed to do, but none of them feel like they're actually any good. They're not feeling like they're working, and you're judging them in the moment, and kind of can be a harsh critic of yourself. But then you come back and you find that, oh, one of those ideas actually could work, and you can pursue it further. So you feel like you know it, but I think, what was that Philadelphia studio? They used to crank out the pop songs, and they'd write 100 pop songs, all of which felt like they had a hook, all of which felt like they had commercial potential, but 100 pop songs to make the one gigantic hit. And so sometimes it hooks you briefly at the moment, but is it really there to stay? You don't really know at first, I don't think.
No, you need to give it that time to get some perspective on it.
Exactly.
When you maybe test it on someone and you show it to them, if you're composing for a film, will you show it to them in the context of the film itself, or will you show it to them just on its own?
It depends on the project and how much time we have to a degree. I've had some real luck with showing palette ideas and theme ideas before we even have picture, but I've also created stuff before we had picture, and none of it was usable at all because the picture turned out to be totally different from what I imagined in my head. If we're on a shorter turnaround, then I will most likely show it with picture and shape it to the picture before sending it along. But if we're early enough and can start playing around and having that discussion about themes and palette early, then I'll send things without picture, just to see if my musical ideas sound like what the director is hearing.
Are you basing that upon the script then? Where are you kind of generating that music from?
So it's a combination of the script and discussions with the director. And then if there is either a book or a novel or a historical context, then I'll do some research into that as well, just to have my head sort of swimming in that world. And so the ideas come out indirectly from that world that I'm thinking about.
How did that function for something like Bernie, where you have this kind of massive amount of real world kind of evidence, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. That one, the research was really easy because my partner, she is from East Texas, just a few towns away from where Bernie was. And, Rick Linklater is also from East Texas. And so we both knew that area well. So able to make playlists of music that people listen to. I'd already explored country music a lot, and I was working on some other country music inspired projects. working with pedal steel and other instruments that you associate as part of that palette. And then there were all the hymns that Jack sang, and that was a whole world to really dive into. So I got a big stack of hymnals and started playing through hymns and listening to different ways that they were arranged and treated, and dove into the world of hymns more than I had really in the past. Country I'd already started diving into. And then, so I had the being in the physical place of East Texas where it takes place, and then a lot of cultural and musical context to go with it.
Were the hymns the first thing you wrote for it?
So the hymns are all real hymns. So they were Jack and Rick and I all had our person that we went to who suggested hymns and who grew up in that world. And so we got together, we had playlists, and we listened and narrowed down to some of our favorite hymns and then started arranging them. And I also, we were talking earlier about where themes come from. And so I would take some of the instrumental music, I would take themes or chord progressions from these hymns and then make my own music out of it.
Interesting. So the spark is coming from an outside perspective.
Yeah, even we did a lot of even sort of source music in the film, and all of it's tied together with some kind of threads, no matter how different it might be in terms of genre or instrumentation.
Kind of like the film itself in terms of the tone of it. You've kind of got so many different things going on there tonally, but somehow it all manages to link together with one cohesive thread.
Yeah, I mean, there's some real complexity in a film that has so much lightness about it at the same time. And I mean, some really heavy stuff in there. But then you've got this comic genius and Jack, who shows off his sort of his more serious acting chops, but mixed in with that sort of fun person that is Jack Black. And then Matthew being as silly as I think he's been in the film that I remember. But he's also from East Texas. So he knew, or I think he's East Texas. I think he's close to Louisiana. I can't remember exactly what town he's from, but he was really of that world as well. And so was able to capture it very easily. And, that's his accent sounds almost exaggerated, but it comes from a real place.
I remember seeing something written about that film where someone had said it was the first kind of light-hearted film that Linklater had done, which I found quite interesting considering where that film goes at some points.
Yeah, it's true. To have a film about a murderer be your most lighthearted film says something. I mean, it's much lighter in some places, but it's like, the Before series, the trilogy, like it never gets that dark. There are no guns in that I remember in the Before trilogy. So it just ranges from one extreme to another in a way that very few than any of his other films do, as far as I remember.
The Before one's an interesting one score-wise, because often when you're trying to come up with the theme, it's kind of encompassing one character completely. If you're trying to come up with a theme for them, whereas the theme in that film, you're almost trying to encompass two characters and their entire relationship together in a piece of music. Does that kind of impact the process and the approach to it?
Yeah, that one was such a tricky one in terms of, I was coming into the third film and the first two films were already so good, and they didn't have a theme like I was trying to make. So I had to be very careful not to ruin what was already working. So I wanted something simple and clear, but malleable. And so I actually came up with 5 different themes and then showed them to Rick and Sandra, his longtime editor and a great collaborator. And they picked one of the 5 themes, and then I based all the music off of that theme.
It's very delicate, the way it's kind of used in that film, the theme.
Yeah, they have such serious arguments and get to some interesting deep places, And I didn't think the music needed to tell the audience that, oh, we're serious now, or oh, they're really not getting along. It was like there was a clarity to that in the writing and in the acting, and there was no need for the music would have made it less serious if it tried to be reflecting on that heaviness that they get to. And so I never wanted to make melodrama out of what was a very effective drama already. So I tried to steer clear of going too far in that direction. I didn't want to turn it into a comedy either, so I tried to just went with the thing that ties them all together is that this romance, and so stuck a little closer to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because often in films you don't want the score, or always in films rather, you don't want the score to try and tell the audience how to feel. There's nothing worse than when it's a sad scene and a sad piece of music starts playing. So is the way around that for you almost just to draw from something else, like you're saying there, and not try and draw from the emotion of the scene, but something deeper in the film?
Yeah, trying to give a frame, either a support structure or a frame or a little bit of both. Yeah, it's only in overtly melodramatic things where that sort of one-to-one relationship totally works, whether it's, something like Star Wars or something like that, where like you don't juxtapose something against an action scene in a Star Wars film. It wouldn't work. Whereas in The Sopranos, in an action sequence, you can juxtapose, especially pop music. Depends on where you are on the vague, but still real entertainment to art, literary to pulp scale, and finding out where this wants to sit. Finding that what is the core thing. You're not telling the audience this is romantic. They already know that, and that's fine. And so you're just sort of experiencing it together with them and providing little markers to give sort of chapter shape to the film.
We were saying there, about the category that Star Wars kind of falls into, where you can't juxtapose and the music is more used just to elevate and emphasize it. Is that, with silent films, would they kind of fall into that category as well, in terms of something that the music kind of has to drive in a different way to something like the before films?
Yeah, I mean, silent films are very hard to do any juxtaposition because you're the entire audio. Different genres can work, so you don't have to be stuck in period. When I first started doing silent films, I would throw up all sorts of different music against like Battleship Potemkin, Eisenstein. I'd put up The Clash and see how that looked against it. I'd put up Chopin, anything you can imagine, and see what it did to the picture, because music and picture will form a relationship no matter how far apart they are. The Sopranos, the example I think it's Happy Together by the Turtles, the very opening scene of the first episode where he's beating that guy up and they're playing this extremely light piece of retro pop music. There may be a silent film out there where that kind of approach would work. When you are such a huge part of the world, a much bigger part of the world than you are in a contemporary film or any sound film, it changes things quite a bit, and your role becomes part of the main storytelling as opposed to a framing or supporting device. You are right there at the center.
I guess what you're saying there about The Sopranos as well, with Happy Together, that's kind of indicative of what is going on in his mind, maybe, in his kind of mental state in that scene, and kind of articulating how calm he is despite the horrific violence unfolding. Yeah,
I mean, that's the fun thing about juxtaposing. It really invites you to make your own interpretation and empowers the audience to explore what this might mean and make connections exactly like that. Whereas if it's a sad scene and you play sad music, you're not asking the audience to do anything. You're not inviting them to do anything. You're which is fine in certain very entertainment pulp, straightforward contexts. It's one of the critical differences between when you're trying to entertain and when you're trying to create art. Not that those are entirely separate things, they're deeply interwoven. But But traditionally art asks more of the audience, and so when you give people that option of saying, "What does this mean?" and then that is empowering, and that brings it closer to what we think of as art.
Yeah, you don't want your music to become almost like an exposition in the kind of same role that it plays in a film.
Right, exactly. Whereas in a silent film, like you were saying, like it can be part of the exposition because you're clarifying a story that we're only otherwise experiencing through one sense as opposed to multiple senses.
Something that does, I suppose, blur the line between what we would classify as art and entertainment, though, to a certain degree, would be I was very much taking a lot of pleasure and enjoyment in watching a video of you destroying a piano whilst playing it.
Yeah, that's a performance that I've done a couple of times. You can only do that so many times. It gives people very different emotions. Some people find it offensive and upsetting and tragic and angering, and others find it exhilarating and liberating and exciting. And I'm careful to only destroy pianos that are on their way to the piano graveyard anyway. I mean, there are many, many pianos in the world, and a lot of them are beyond real repair.
It's kind of like a New Orleans funeral for a piano, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. It's like New Orleans or a Viking funeral where like you burn that ship and send it off in a last blaze, and or like you say, New Orleans, where it's dying, but you find cause for celebration and remembering all. I mean, those pianos were old and they had played so many notes and had been in so many contexts. The Red Violin film really captures that. Like these instruments have history and stories, and this is the end of their story. And rather than just quietly sending it off as loudly as possible, and the Who are the sort of precedent to that, and people found the Who upsetting, but also plenty of people also found it exhilarating, and piano players never really got to do that, and so I gave it my best try. I don't know which version you saw, but the Blaine brothers, who I did the Out of Her Mind, this BBC Two series this past season, they're the ones that edited that. Chris edited that video.
I saw two. There's one from South by Southwest in 2015, and there's kind of more of an amateur one from 2011 where you're in a white suit.
Yeah, so it's the 2015 that the Blaines were here, and that's when we met, and that's what led to me working on that show with them.
Nice. How would you describe the release of energy from doing that? Because it's different to just playing a piano.
Oh, it's extremely different. And, a sledgehammer is pretty heavy. So I'm always, adrenaline gets me going and gets me into it. But I'm always more tired and more sore afterwards than I realized. But both the two times I've done it, like the audience has been with me. And so we sort of go on that together. But there's there's horrible things about our instinct to destroy things and our violent instincts, but those instincts exist. And what do you do with those? How do you release those in a healthy way without just building on them or deepening them? And for me, like playing drums, or in this case, destroying a piano, is a really fun way to release that pent up energy and just let it go. Plus, it makes crazy noises while you're doing it, so it's sonically fun as well.
Yeah, it turns quite a negative emotion into a really positive experience. I mean, everyone who's there then gets to take a piece of the piano home too, and kind of has that memory attached to it now.
Yeah, on the 2011 one. There was a kid there who was really young, 3 or 4, and he went home with a piece of piano, and now he's in high school or something, and he was in a class I taught recently, which or a young composer program we've been doing. So it's that he's got a literal piece of a performance that I did, and now we have this relationship when he's much older.
Man. You taking a sledgehammer to a piano in that video kind of has similar energy to Alex Jones giving a speech in A Scanner Darkly, I find. That was where my mind kind of went with that.
Interesting.
Who you then worked with. Was that how you came upon him?
That is how I came. Yes, exactly. We met working with Linklater, and that was obviously before Alex went down the extremely dark pathway he's gone on since. But at the time, he was an interesting, intense character about town, and so we met during Scanner, and then I feel like there was some other thing we met during as well. And he asked if I wanted to score some of his work, and I said sure, and we tried it. Obviously, I'm not working with him anymore. He turned some corners that you can't really turn back from. But what a intense person to get to know. He was actually one of the easiest directors to work with because it was crystal clear when he liked and didn't like something.
Was he kind of known then? Did he have this reputation? Not in the same way he does now, but was he a known figure in the local
He was
community?
a known figure, yes. More as a quirky, crazy, fun, intense character than a spreader of lies and hate. We of course drifted apart once he switched over to the lies and hate approach, but he was known in his own way at that point.
Yeah, he kind of just slipped down the rabbit hole shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I've had other friends who you play damaged until you are, or you play like you don't understand something until you don't. And he just got deeper and deeper into this persona that he had built for himself. And it was sad and horrifying to watch happen.
Why do you think we do that? Construct these personas for ourselves that we then eventually slip into.
Oof, that is a deep question, and I would only be guessing. But it seems to me that we seek meaning, we seek structure, we seek acknowledgement and reward. And once people appreciate something about you, it's easy to keep doing more of it. And also, you set a precedent, and you can set up a trap for yourself. For example, I do a lot of shows in Austin, and because I like to experiment with my work in public as it's developing. And it's very easy to burn out an audience. So you have to be careful and make the shows different, give people a reason to come back. And so it's not the same material over and over again. There are exceptions to that. If like a country band that plays two-stepping music, you want to go and you want to know two-step to that music. So you want the music to have you want to know what you're going to. Whereas when people come to see me, they don't necessarily know what they're coming to see. In trying to address how do I stay relevant in town where I'm living for years and years and years and doing more and more shows, I started making the shows bigger. And because that was a way to make it, you got to see this one. This is the biggest thing I've ever done. And then it would get bigger. And then there were 40 musicians. And eventually you run out of resources to make that happen. You run out of rehearsal time to make it quality. And it sort of becomes, it doesn't have a positive endpoint. So I had to regroup, rethink, and how can I make the shows unique and special and inviting without getting caught in that trap? But sometimes I think people like Alex get caught in their own trap that they set for themselves.
What conclusions did you come to once you had that realization? How did you figure out a way to make the show special and unique without just making them bigger and bigger and bigger?
I think by attaching them to things that I was passionate about, extra musical things, non-musical things. The Pancha show is a good example. It doesn't have 40 people. It has, on stage 8 people, but only 2 of them are singers. But it's a very deep dive into this culturally rich, historically rich character and story and place and culture. So it gives it a very distinct quality, separate from my other work. And so rather than it being more people, it's more deep in terms of its associations, and people can explore that with me and with the whole team.
Yeah, so the personal attachment to it is almost more unique and special, but the scope is still pretty sizable for that one.
Yeah, narrowing the scope so it's easier to get the higher quality. You know, the fewer people you have, the easier it is to rehearse multiple times, the easier it is to develop work, to communicate on stage. You know, like when I listen to classical, I'm much more likely to listen to chamber music than I am to orchestral music around the studio or whenever. That I find it much easier to relate to and dive into, but also to hear what's going on musically.
It's interesting what we're saying there about scope as well, in terms of more relating it to like a direct musical sense as a composer. There is this perception that an artist must either have, quite a narrow scope but incredible depth in it, or when someone is exceptional in one specific area, or they can either have a narrow depth but incredible scope and be adverse in a multitude of different styles. Is that a myth? Can you be both? Can you have both depth and scope, do you think? Because that's kind of something you've done throughout your career.
I definitely lean on scope harder than I do depth, but I do depth in a short to medium term way that I hope gives each piece that kind of context. I'll never, like, my piano skills will never be as deep as someone who is more disciplined in practicing and is more disciplined in developing their technical facility and the voice associated with that. There's that certain kind of narrow focused depth that I'll never be able to do. You know, when you take it out of a musical context and you try to understand a problem in the world, or how something came to be, having a wider context gives you a deeper understanding of that problem or that history. If you're studying, I don't know, if a city has an infrastructure problem, if you didn't look at any other cities and didn't think about how these infrastructures came to be and look at other examples of what was good infrastructure, then you're just starting from zero. But if you dive into a much broader context, then you can have a richer palette of ideas. And that's what I'm hoping for with the wide scope, the sort of dilettante quality of knowing a little bit about a lot of things can help actually give that a very different kind of depth from the sort of technical, narrowly focused depth. I find there's strength in both, and I don't think it's dichotomous. I think there's a range, and people find their place along that line. And I really enjoy the deep dives for a little while, and then move on to another project, and then do another deep dive.
So those deep dives, for example, would be like the research that you went into for the opera, when you kind of looked at the history of all of that.
Exactly. And like right now I'm doing a collaboration about insects. So I'm learning a lot about insects, and I audited a class at the university about entomology, and I'm getting to know some entomologists and reading books about insects and historical entomologists and things like that. And so then there's a whole sonic world associated with insects as well. And so what do insects sound like? So that's one of my current deep dives.
Do certain instruments feel evocative of certain insects in that way?
Yes. A bowed instrument is easiest to get some of those sounds. If you actually bow the wrong way, which I think is probably horrible for the hairs on the bow, you can get a buzzing sound pretty easily. And if you bow in a circle, you get a buzzing that sounds like it's in motion. All instruments have different strengths and different palettes, but stringed instruments like a cello, I think, is the easiest thing I can think of right off the bat to capture some part of the insect world.
I'm intrigued by as well, what did you dive into when it came to the depth for A Scanner Darkly? Because that's a score that seems to kind of twist and turn in so many different directions, and is kind of constantly moving and shape shifting.
Yeah, we had a long time to work on that, and we started. It was actually the score for Last Tango in Paris, which had saxophone.
I used to play that on the saxophone.
Oh, really? Perfect. Okay. There's a tiny bit of saxophone left in the film, but at first we had a whole mess of saxophone. The opening scene had saxophones. It was sprinkled throughout because that was a palette that Rick and I were both interested in before it was even shot. But the deeper we got into it, the more it felt wrong. And actually, so took away the saxophone and instead started exploring the guitar and developed that palette in place of that while I kept the same drums. The drums were the same from the original sketch that had horns. And then the other thing I did was try to develop a palette where, just like the film was shot in live action but then animated on top of, I recorded mostly acoustic instruments, with the electric guitar being the exception, but there are no digital or sampled or synthesized instruments in there. And then instead of mixing them like natural instruments, putting them through effects that you would typically associate with guitar, and layering them and trying to transform them into something that was not quite natural, was the musical version of rotoscope. That's not on every cue or anything like that, but that was part of the idea.
That's fascinating. Have you done anything like that before, where you kind of take something from the film and parallel it completely in the music in that way? Like a style or a technique?
That's probably the most overt example of it. And it was really satisfying to do in that way. It was hard. It took a long time, but it was very satisfying.
Much again like rotoscoping.
But yeah, exactly. I'm sure I have, but nothing's coming right to mind. I mean, I do think a lot about what is the aesthetic philosophy behind this, and are there any, you see parallels historically, like, Impressionism has its equivalent in music, and Dada had its equivalent in music. So whatever aesthetic philosophy is behind the film can probably be distilled to something that can be applied to music. And that is part of the conversation with the director in the early stages, where you're trying to figure what are the concepts behind this, not just the story and all that, but where is it coming from artistically?
It almost comes back to this idea as well of music being a language, because in that sense you can translate anything into it.
Yeah, exactly. The analogies of music as language work really well and hold up as analogies often don't. If you start getting into musical specifics, it can be very hard unless you and the director have a lot of common knowledge about music and you understand what they mean by certain words. But what one person means by raucous and exciting music or fun and playful music might be radically different from yours. Whereas if they're talking specifically about music, or what they mean by heavy. Whereas if you can start to understand what they're trying to do with their film, or then you get more to the heart of the matter and can try to come up with something that fits that.
Will you ever have conversations with a director about music in that way and try and find out where they kind of sit with music, or do you just put that to one side and focus on the film and the kind of themes themselves?
Sometimes they already have a strong idea of music that they're interested in, so that then the conversation will steer in that direction, because they are, whether it's a period something or just music that they're excited about. And so I think it's project to project. I try not to set any hard rules about my process when meeting a director or early in whatever thing we're trying to make. Even the same, like Rick, on one film he may have a clear idea of what he wants, and another film he may not really know. And so trying to figure out what it is. And of course sometimes films often come with their temp track. So that tells me a lot about what the director and the editor are thinking in terms of music.
If every collaboration is completely different and fresh in that way, can the scores that you craft or the projects you're working on ever be a stepping stone kind of stylistically, or at least in your mind from one to the next, or is each project a completely, fresh slate?
Hopefully it's in a way both. We certainly learn from project to project, and your vocabulary builds and your skill set builds, and the arsenal of tools that you know and understand and have access to builds. With every project, whether it's film or theater or dance or albums or commissions, like you're broadening what you have to offer and what you can bring to a project, or at least that's the hope. Then the what's exciting about collaborating is that because each one is new, there is that freshness about it. So you bring your sort of lifelong body of work and skills building and vocabulary to this brand new thing. So it might open up a new door or a new path that I wouldn't have thought to go down on my own.
Has what excites you about collaborating and composing evolved as you've, gotten further on in your career?
Yeah, I think it's almost constantly evolving. I think at the core of it, what excites me is learning, just being curious and trying something new, which is why I was never, not that if you go in that narrow focused way, you can always be learning something about a narrow and focused thing. So I'm always sort of restless, and if I hear a new kind of music or a new artist or something like that, I'm curious to go further in that and learn from them and add to that. So this meandering exploration and learning about music and sound, always changing, and it's always teaching me something new. The core of it is not changing in that I'm always exploring, but what I'm exploring and what that means to the music theory behind what I'm doing, or the techniques or the instruments behind what I'm doing, that's shifting and evolving all the time.